Great. Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Darren. And I have to say, I want to be called a Southerner someday. So I'm going to work on it. I've been coming to Arkansas for about 2.5, almost 3 years now, working with Southern, which has been a real privilege. Is the mic okay? Can you hear? And so I love it, but I've got work to do to meet Jan's contribution to the South, but it's on my list. So we're going to have a conversation tonight. This is not a lecture. I want to have a conversation, want to have interaction with you about impact investing. And we framed it impact investing globally and locally, because the point is this is happening everywhere, and the opportunities to engage in impact investing are everywhere. Right where we're sitting here tonight, just outside the doors, in Ethiopia, in South Africa, in the UK, where I come from, although I am an American, as Jan did say. So that's why I want to have a conversation. I have a couple of slides here. We're in a school, so I thought, I have a few slides. I like doing that. But please, if you have questions or comments as we go, I know we have a couple of people in the audience whose examples I have in my slides, so I will certainly turn to you. Who better to speak to your own examples than yourselves and your organization. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight. So first of all, taking stock of who's in the room, how many would self-identify as an impact investor? Would you identify yourself as an impact? Doesn't matter about size, but would you identify? Show of hands. How many of you have a bank account? How many of you would say that bank account is in a bank that is focused on impact, positive impact? Well, guess what? By the end of tonight, I'm going to demonstrate to you, you are all impact investors, and you're going to make some changes, perhaps, in where you decide to bank as a specific example. But that's the point. It's accessible. It's available to all of us. Okay, so kicking in, I think I was told how to do this. Great. I want to have a bit of a conversation, putting impact investing into a global and local context, highlighting how impact investing is a distinct pursuit. It's different from other types of investing pursuits. It's not better or worse necessarily, although I have a particular bias in favor of it. I will reveal that now. There is an agenda here. But I just want to put it into a bit of a context. I'm going to explain a little bit more. Jan gave a bit of an introduction of who Enclude is, but how do we fit into this conversation as a firm? Not a lot on that, just a very brief comment. And then I really want to get into some examples, talk about some trends, and then some specific examples. But as I say, please raise hands, jump up, share as we're going through. So first off, I want to, before we go to the content, I want to just share with you a framing, a definition of impact investing to keep in mind. We're going to come back to it in the course of the conversation. Because the challenge with impact investing at the moment is, on the one hand, there's a lot of excitement and attention. I mean, David Brooks writes about it in the New York Times. It's entered mainstream vernacular. On the other hand, there's just a lot of challenge with language. People will talk about double bottom line, triple bottom line, values-based investing, socially responsible investing, impact investing. So, what does it mean? Is there a jargon here? Is there a secret code? A secret formula I need to understand? Actually not. It's very simple. When you cut to the chase, this is about investing money with the intention and the expectation that you will generate a social, environmental, economic return alongside a financial return. When you cut to the chase, that's what it's about. People apply it in different ways, and we'll hear about that in some examples, but just I would encourage you to keep that in mind as we go through. So as a framework, I want to refer to the UN global goals. Hopefully this is familiar with folks. I will say in Europe, this is being used with more regularity than I find in the US. It's interesting. I'm not sure exactly why, but it is. And so these goals were put forth by the United Nations in 2015 to frame and challenge all of us as society to think about where we want to be in 2030, so in a 15-year time frame of addressing some fundamental aspects of addressing basic needs in society and building more inclusive, sustainable local economies. And what I love about the Sustainable Development Goals myself, although they're 17, you could argue too many, but what I like about them is they're really accessible. It's lay language. It's not code language. So gender equality, quality education, good health and well-being, sustainable cities and communities, life below the water, climate action, affordable and clean energy. So it really talks about the kind of the totality of how we might visualize an inclusive, sustainable, resilient society. And I share this because I think it is a useful frame for thinking about how impact investing as an approach, as a set of tools, can help to tackle, to address, to make progress on the sustainable goals. Just by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the sustainable goals or the global goals? Is this, yeah, about half of us. And some people call them the SDGs, some people call them global goals, but this is the 17. And you'll start to see, I think, this logo, this graphic, more frequently. So with that as background, the one thing I should say, it's about emerging and emerged markets. This is not an emerging markets conversation. Just like the whole conversation tonight is about global, local, the same thing when they promulgated the United Nations goals. This was not saying the relevance is unique to sub-Saharan Africa. The relevance is everywhere, and that's why I also think they're really powerful. So now let's talk about impact investing as a tool within this global goals framework. So this is a little bit of a kind of, I would say, a finance type slide, but it's not designed to tell you about finance. It's designed to try to help you understand what is the question you are asking if you are an impact investor. That's the point of distinction. There's a whole range of investment activities out there. How this is framed is on the left-hand side is what we're referring to as traditional investing, and on the right-hand side, philanthropy, or really charitable giving. And in between, you see as you move from the left to the right, traditional to responsible, sustainable, impact-driven, and philanthropy. This is becoming a bit of a standard reference guide, a framework for investors and people who work in finance and capital to give some guideposts, not to have these kind of definitional language challenges, but to give some guideposts. But the interesting point that I'd like to share with you is that it's the question, it's that intention at the bottom of this slide. So when you're a traditional investor, effectively you're saying, look, I'm aware that there could be some potential negative impact of my investment, fossil fuels, for example, but I'm not really going to do anything about it. I mean, I hear you. I hear it, but it's not what I'm going to do anything about. So I'm investing, a lot of people maybe are investing through a fund where they don't have a lot of direct influence, but they're not probing, they're not pushing, they're not divesting, they're not making an affirmative choice to put their capital into things that align with the issues that they care about. Not to condemn folks who do that, but that's one category. And frankly, if we were looking at 20 years ago in the capital markets and financial activity, the bulk of investment was in that bucket of traditional. You move over to responsible. So in the 1960s, 1970s, generally, I would say people hallmark that period when it started to emerge, that folks were saying, look, I want to behave responsibly. I want to feel good about where my money is going. And again, remember, this is whatever amount of money we're talking about. This is not a conversation about high net worth capital and individuals. It's for every one of us. We all have bank accounts. We all do things with our money, whatever our means are. And so the notion was I want to behave responsibly. And so what started to emerge were screens. I'm going to screen my investment for firearms. I have a view about that. I'm going to screen my investment for fossil fuels. I have a view about that. And so people started to put up a screen, negative screen, or a positive screen to say, I don't want that type of exposure. That moved into more sustainable investment where there was an emergence of analysis, detailed analysis of what we call ESG, environmental, social, and governance dimensions of business operations. And the analysis started to show that if you are a company, any kind of company, any company on the planet, if you start to use water as an input to your company more responsibly, if you start to have a board of your company that's more reflective of the stakeholders that you are serving, guess what? Your performance goes up. This has now been documented extensively. Companies like Unilever, Danone, the yogurt makers, they're leaders in this field, but it's not limited to them. And so there's an emergence, this body of work, and financial advisors started to grab this and say, great, I can give better investment choices to my clients if I'm looking at these ESG indicators, so both for funds and for direct investments. Impact-driven capital, impact-driven investment is going one step further. It's asking a different question. The question you're asking, which I think is the really exciting question, is I want to solve something. I want to tackle something purposefully with my capital. Again, whatever my means are. So for example, I want to tackle something about climate change. I want to tackle something about education and the education. But there's a purposeful, intentional decision you're making as you think about where your capital goes. The example of the bank that I mentioned earlier. There are lots of banks out there. You heard from Skip's introduction about Southern Bancorp. That's an impact-driven financial institution. Choosing to deposit your money in a bank like Southern is one of those impact choices. It's an intentional, affirmative choice that you're making. So the way I think about it is that if we move from the left to the right, left-hand side, you're being very passive. Well, my money's being invested by other people. I know stuff is going on, but I'm not going to really look at it. And then you're becoming more and more active in taking directive control of your decisions as you move on the right-hand side to impact-driven. And the reason I keep philanthropy up there, some people would say, wait a minute, philanthropy, that's different. That's one-way traffic of money. That's not expecting a return of the money. Philanthropy is phenomenally important in this conversation. Phenomenally important. I think many times people in the field have underestimated and under-celebrated the importance of philanthropy. Often the most inventive, the most pioneering solutions that become available to impact investors have been seeded, have started with philanthropy and capital. It takes the risk. It pushes the envelope. It can be imaginative. And the trend that we're seeing now in the industry as there's more maturation is the combination of philanthropy and impact investment, meaning around the same business, around the same enterprise, you will have people who have put grant to work alongside people who have made an equity investment, a debt investment, a guarantee investment, and the like. And that, I think, is really important, particularly when we go to the deeper impact opportunities where there's a new business model, where there's a bit more risk to what we're solving for. So I think it's important to keep philanthropy in this picture. So just a quick word about who we are and why we're in this conversation. We are all in. 100% of what we do at Enclude is impact filtered, impact oriented, impact driven. Why? Because we were born out of the ShoreBank family and the Triodos family, two long-standing 30-plus year institutions that were founded themselves on principles of impact. So we're very, very fortunate to have as our parents, if you will, as a company, two veterans in impact-driven activity. We are an advisory firm. We're not a bank ourselves. We have two types of advisory services. One is what we call capacity solutions. Think of it as consulting, but really driving as we give advice for a permanent solution to an impact-driven operation. And on the capital side, which is what we're talking about tonight, capital advisory, we go out and we raise impact-aligned capital for enterprises, for financial institutions, and for funds. We've had the pleasure, as Darren said at the beginning, of working with Southern over the past couple of years and together just succeeded in the first milestone on the current capital campaign. Our theory, the philosophy of the firm, is that advice alone is not going to tend to the impact opportunities we see, and money alone isn't going to do it either. So it's combining capacity and capital. That's our philosophy. And think of us a little bit in the impact investing conversation really as an impact investment bank. Investment banking has become a phrase, a description that a lot of people would say, ooh, that's about the crisis, that's about those folks in New York just seeking extraordinarily commercial returns. But investment banking is an activity, actually. So we're shy about it sometimes, but effectively from a functional point of view, that's what we are. We're impact investment bankers, which makes us quite different. And I would say in our work, the goal is really this alignment between investors and the investees. And I emphasize that alignment point quite a bit because in impact investing, one of the concerns sometimes is that we get into a situation where people are exercising their subjective view. Some people care deeply about a healthcare initiative. That's the impact I really care about. Someone else says it's all about gender and gender lens investing. Someone else says, I care deeply about education. Our job is not to judge any of that. It's not our job. Our job, though, is to make sure we're aligning that set of interest, criteria, objectives with the investment opportunity. And particularly because we typically represent the operating entity, the investee, the actual business, the people who are, in my view, generating the impact that the investors want to support. So that's where we sit on the table. So it's critically important that the operating business receives the capital that it needs on the terms that it needs to allow it to deliver its impact objectives. So that's just where we sit very quickly. So what are some of the global trends? Investors are seeking impact. This came from a bit of research that Enclude did. We pulled it from a number of different sources. So interestingly, and I think this will make the point very clear, that these themes are global, local. So smallholder farmers are a big theme, and sustainable agriculture, financial inclusion, and this is not only microfinance. Financial inclusion really does mean extending financial services and products to underserved. Microfinance is a piece of that, but there's also leasing, there's small business finance, there's a whole host of activities that fall into financial inclusion. Clean power, education, health, water, sanitation, and hygiene, which is increasingly being referred to as WASH, as a sector of interest, affordable housing, women's economic empowerment, technology, migrants, refugees, and communities. I would say particularly living in Europe, that is a very high priority at the moment. I think everybody's aware of some of the challenges that they're experiencing. And then there's a category of others. So that gives you a sense of the themes. Geography, it is truly a global phenomenon. This graph shows you where money is being deployed now by self-identified impact investors. There's a whole cadre of investors out there now who wouldn't necessarily use the vernacular impact investing, but actually when you look at what they're doing, they are making decisions with that intentionality, I said at the beginning, of seeking more than a financial return. So this is a more limited subset, but I just wanted to give you a feel. But it is geographic. On the right-hand side, I think this is interesting. Again, this is the group of self-identified impact investors. Nearly all of them, 94%, are making a direct investment. That means putting equity or debt into an operating company, like Southern Bancorp, for example. The second graph shows you that about half the folks, same group, are also investing into funds, investment funds, fund-like vehicles. It's interesting to me because I think that reinforces if you are pursuing impact investing, you want the touch. You want to really have that feel that your capital is having the impact you thought it was going to have. It's also a way that people learn. I found that a lot of impact investors, when they're starting, they start with a very modest investment directly because they're really trying to get a feel for what is this activity. And then from there, they oftentimes will go into fund and fund-like vehicles. It is a global movement, and it's interesting. What I just showed you before was where money is being deployed and the sectors that are attracting the money. This shows you where most of the investors sit. 54% of them, or 56%, sit here in the United States. It is the largest community of impact investors. It's growing globally, but this is the biggest community. And I would say, interestingly, the US impact investors, and we are in touch with many of them, when they started, many of them, honestly, they first put their money to work outside the United States. Not all, but a lot of them. So we were, in fact, yesterday on the phone with one who was saying to us that when they started, they were very focused on clean and renewable energy. And they decided to focus on that in sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Because they just felt that was the greatest need. They didn't mean to say it's not relevant here, but that's where they started. But interestingly, they're now asking themselves the questions, maybe we should be deploying our capital a little bit closer to home. So this just shows you the population of the participants. A very interesting development, and we have Ray in the room today, because you're right on, well, you're related to this, the Appalachian Funders Network. So one trend that's happening in this country is that impact investors are coming together to form these collaboratives, clubs, or communities of investing together. That doesn't mean setting up an investment fund. It means coming together and thinking about how they might be able to combine, pool their resources in a certain set of themes, a certain set of geographic priorities. And it's stunning to me how many of these are going on. Benefit Chicago is one that was rolled out about a year ago. MacArthur Foundation was a lead, but it tapped a number of stakeholders in Chicago, and it was all about looking at what's going on in Chicago and trying to say, let's double down on place and try to make our impact capital work here. Ray, you might speak a little bit later about the Appalachia example, but there's a very active Appalachia Funders Network. So there are a lot, you can see it, it's quite distributed around the country. So let's give some specific examples here. Using this sustainable development goal lens, just because I think it's helpful to organize our conversation, I've just put a few examples. Sector on the left-hand side, some local examples, and some global examples. And you will recognize, I know we have people from Heifer International here in the audience. Heifer? Oh. Yep, there you are. And you're on both. You're local and you're global. So I may ask you to say a few words about that because it's interesting, I think, how you've pursued both. We've got the Walton Family Foundation. I don't know if anyone's from the Walton Family Foundation in the room tonight, but they're here. They're familiar to all of you, and they've done some extraordinary work here. And then we have Southern Bank Corp, also mentioned. So just to highlight a couple. So in education, and I think people know a little bit about the public charter startup grants and investment that the Walton Family Foundation has made here in Arkansas. It's been extraordinary over a number of years with terrific results. And in education, Omidyar Network, which is Pierre Omidyar, one of the founders of eBay, it's his family office foundation. He's invested in a group of schools called the Spark Schools. And it's a very similar motivation. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the Walton Family Foundation was asking a similar question to Pierre Omidyar, is that in these communities, public schools are not serving the needs of young people and providing quality education. What can we do about that? What types of resources can we deploy? The Spark Schools are specifically in South Africa, which on the continent in sub-Saharan Africa, it's one of the worst situations on the education side. In agriculture, maybe our friends at Heifer want to say a bit about what they're doing here locally. The international example I gave was Root Capital, who I'm sure will be familiar to our friends from Heifer. Root is a terrific agricultural specialist, impact investor, and Yedent is a company in Ghana that focuses in fortified cereals and really focused on issues of malnutrition. And it's an investment in a company that is producing and distributing those fortified cereals. SME support, so Southern Bank Corp, you've heard from Darren, investing in low and moderate income communities in the Mid-South. And the other example I gave was BRAC in Uganda, and this is an interesting example of BRAC, which is the largest development organization in the world, based out of Bangladesh, now operating in 12 countries outside of Bangladesh. They set up initially a microfinance not-for-profit organization in East Africa, one in Uganda, one in Tanzania, one in South Sudan. And now they have transformed their Uganda entity into a Tier 2 regulated bank, which is a terrific further development of what they can do. They're the leading provider of small ticket dollars, smallholder dollars in Uganda. And then on the energy side, I think this is an interesting example. In New York State, there's the Housing Finance Agency Energy Bond, and this is issuing debt for investment into residential housing with a green set of objectives. So making the residential housing more aligned with environmental priorities and needs. So it was a specific debt offering linked to the residential housing for greening of that housing. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a company referenced Engie from France and Phoenix. Phoenix was the first solar home system provider in Uganda. So these solar home systems, so people who are living off-grid, who don't have any access to energy at all, and they came up with an affordable solar home system. This is transformative. Kids can do their homework at night because there's a light. Businesses can stay open at night. The household can just have light inside the household. It's unbelievable, and they really cracked the nut on making these systems affordable to low-income rural communities. They have done several rounds of financing, and Engie, which is a large French energy company, has just invested in Phoenix. And I think it's a sign that these sustainable development goals are attracting the attention even of the large corporates, and we'll see more of that. So I don't know if our friends from Heifer want to say anything about the example here at all, your examples?
My name's Bob Bloom.
Let me get a mic to you.
Sir. My name is Bob Bloom. I'm the CFO at Heifer. Behind me is Ben Wiebrink. He's actually just moved over from a different position into Impact Ventures, which is a group within Heifer that is focusing on impact investing opportunities. So we're fairly early on in this journey. We have a sister company, the Heifer Foundation, that has about $150 million of assets, primarily endowments and so forth. They have allocated Hi, Jan. They have allocated $7.5 million of their assets to this initiative as sort of seed capital. And actually, my CEO and I are traveling to Northern California next week to go out and see if we can attract some more capital into this initiative. So you have two things listed here. One is on the local side. We work with two cooperatives in Arkansas, one on the vegetable side, which is the New South Produce Cooperative you have referenced here. Actually, that slide probably should say our grassroots cooperative, which is the livestock-based cooperative, which is what we've used to provide some capital into the organization to get these farmers sort of stabilized. We've worked with Root Capital in Mexico with some of our coffee farmers. We are working in Nepal with a regional bank in Nepal, working with 138,000 goat farmers. The AgCam is a Mexico-based, which I'm not as familiar with, but Ben can talk with that. But we've got about 5 or 6 active investments right now. It's fairly nascent right now, but we're kind of staffing up for it. We see a lot of opportunity with the energy around it, and we've got to get our story kind of connected with the people that are interested.
It's fantastic. Can I ask you 2 follow-ups? One is, can you say a little bit about how you move from grant into impact investing, just the thinking inside the organization? And secondly, are there differences in your experience between how you're approaching your work domestically and how you're approaching your work? Not the specifics of the project, but how you're approaching it. Or are there more similarities than differences? If you could just share a little bit with us.
Sure. Our budget is about $125 million a year, largely generated through direct marketing. We ship out 30 million catalogs a year. It's great. It's unrestricted funds, but it's not growing. So we're looking for diversification of revenues. And as we've sort of grown up with our model, we call our model, sort of original model, values-based holistic community development, working with smallholder farmers.
Right.
What our CEO has sort of transitioned us to over the last several years is building in the market development side, so building into the value chains. We're working with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in East Africa for the last 8 years, working with $180,000 dairy farmers. And at some point, they're producing a lot of milk. So what do they do with all that milk? So we've got to connect them with dairy processors and the market. So that has required a lot of capital investment. So we're sort of bridging from philanthropy, solely philanthropy, into another source of capital, which we believe can be a real catalyst, because these farmers, as we all know in this room, are not bankable typically. So we've got to find them access to capital, because we believe it can unlock a lot of the opportunity within these.
It's a perfect example, and it's why at the beginning I had philanthropy on the same page as we're talking about investment capital. Your example is a perfect illustration of that, and what I love about your example also is that what we're trying to do, remember the problem we're solving for, you're solving for aggregating that milk and getting it to market. And there's a gap right now. There's a market failure between the farmer production and the market asset. And you actually, as impact organization, you are solving for that and then driving the capital that you need to execute on that. So I think it's a great example. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, super. And Ray, since we're pausing you for some examples, do you want to say a little bit about your work in Appalachia?
Sure.
I just think I want to bring it to life a little bit with the examples.
Here, I'll stand up so I can be heard better. My name's Ray Chrisman. I'm on the Southern Bancorp Community Partners Board, and I come originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Spent most of my life and career there, and a number of years ago got involved in work in Appalachia, working with the Appalachian Regional Commission. And there's 2 parallel efforts going on in Appalachia right now that are interesting. One is an effort that I helped create about 4 years ago, working with the Appalachian Regional Commission called Appalachian Community Capital, which was an effort sponsored by the Appalachian Regional Commission, which is a federal agency created way back 50 years ago during Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. But they saw the real problem in Appalachia as being one of a lack of capital. There just wasn't new capital coming in to support business sustainability and growth. And Appalachia Community Capital was an effort to create a regional CDFI that could work with local CDFIs and not only attract more capital from impact investors around the country, but also, and it would then be passed along to the local CDFIs, but also look for opportunities to provide technical assistance to CDFIs that needed, or even create new CDFIs where there were holes in the network. Meanwhile, there's another group that was on Laurie's slide called the Appalachian Funders Network. It's an informal coalition of funders who invest in Appalachia. There are not a lot of big funders in Appalachia. Tremendous wealth was created in Appalachia mainly through resource extraction, but those people made their money and left the region over 100 plus years. So there are some small foundations. There's one in Pittsburgh called the Benham Foundation that invests only in Appalachia that I separately am doing some work for, but there's not a lot. But those funders that do exist, including a lot of small community foundations, have come together in recent years, created an Appalachian Funders Network, and now they are looking to create a new entity called Impact Appalachia. And it is similar to what we created with the Appalachian Community Capital Initiative, but they want to go further and go beyond supporting new business development and business growth, and also look at finding funding support for social infrastructure, physical infrastructure, dealing with other issues like the opioid crisis and things that are connected, obviously, to business growth, but aren't necessarily supporting individual businesses. So we're in an interesting place right now of having one effort in place, another one in process, and we want to make sure that we align those two together and are not competing for funding in the future. Yeah. So yeah. I hope that's helpful.
That is helpful. Thank you. I mean, I think the examples, as I say, really do bring it to life. And I think Ray's example also suggests there's a growing interest. It is a challenge sometimes to ensure that we're actually not unintentionally diluting efforts, because there is a lot of so much, it's hard work to do these transactions, to pull investors in, and that we should be trying to coordinate and come together. But also in Ray's example, it's the clarity of what am I solving for? That's a very place-based driven agenda. What am I solving for in this place? But that is the question at the core of what they are doing. So I think with all the examples, and I wanted to open up to questions or comments from others who want to share, do you make money doing impact investing? We should talk about that, because there is a conversation in the broader community that, okay, we're doing all these extraordinarily good things, generating social return, environmental return, community return, but is there also a financial proposition here? And I am absolutely here to tell you the answer is yes. Yes, there is. The important thing, however, is to make sure that your expectation of financial return is grounded in what the core of the business is doing. Too many times we have these financial returns that we're somehow imposing an expectation that we've either read out of a book or we've heard it from someone else, that this business must generate 15% IRR return. Where is that coming from? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The analysis has to be grounded in what is the purpose of the business, what is the product and service of the business, Who are the customers and clients of the business? What is an affordable product and service for the clients you're trying to serve? Then you figure out what the capital you need to grow that business, and ultimately what the return can be to the investors. We've got to reclaim the conversation about financial return. We have to reclaim it if we are going to be successful in pursuing an impact economy. So I am here to tell you it is absolutely possible. There are numerous examples, many of which are here, that you can invest with a clear intention of pursuing a social, environmental, economic development objective and make a financial return. But the question should be asked in that way. What are we first doing here? What are we solving for with the business? And then you analyze the expected financial return from there. And that there's work to be done, I would say honestly, in our industry, because we are still confronted with this legacy default notion that financial indicators should come first, and they then define the proposition, and it really should be the other way around. And that, if we're evangelizing about anything, it's that, as we go around and talk to investors. So let me pause here. There are a couple things I want to say at the end, but let me pause here and see if there are other questions or comments or examples people want to share. I did want this to be an interaction between us. Darren.
So, Laurie, I was hoping you would spend some time talking a little bit about the Global Alliance for Banking on Values.
Great.
And talk about Enclude's work and I think MIT's research are comparing these very large, too big to fail banks that in 2008 the government bailed out. Now they're bigger than they were in 2008. Talk about the research around their profitability compared to these mission-focused, values-based banks that make up the GABV.
Super. Thank you, Darren. So Darren said in his opening, he mentioned this Global Alliance for Banking on Values. What it is, it's a group of independent banks, truly global. So we have banks from the United States, banks from Europe, banks from South Asia, banks from Sub-Saharan Africa. It's the only alliance of its kind. These banks are mostly small to mid-sized banks in their local geography. They are quite diverse in terms of their business model. Some of them are environmental banks, some of them are small and medium-sized enterprise, SME banks, but they are completely aligned in their banking model. And their banking model puts people first. They are putting money into the real economy. So what are we solving for? We are solving for real economy, building wealth in our local communities. That's the glue that knits these banks together. There are over 50 of them now, and we have had, Enclude has had the privilege of advising the Global Alliance since inception in 2009, and now they're over 50. It is a great way to say, how do you build community where you have banks operating very locally in their markets, and yet they're part of this global organization. And why did they come together? They came together to raise the profile of these banks, because on their own, maybe they're known in their local community, but they don't have as much recognition outside of that. They came together also to be a reference point for others. And when we were deciding how to be a reference point, we wanted to analyze, as Darren was suggesting, the financial performance of these banks. Given what I just said a minute ago, that finance is still very much a focal point as people analyze impact institutions, we wanted to debunk the myth that somehow small, mid-size, impact-driven banks represent a financial trade-off to investors, that somehow they don't perform as well as the big banks, the too big to fail banks. So we did a study before the financial crisis, during the financial crisis, after the financial crisis, over a 10-year period. And we update that research every single year. It's available on the website of the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. And guess what? Our banks outperform the too big to fail banks, particularly when you factor in lower volatility of performance. The big banks through the crisis were up and down and up and down. Our banks were much steadier because they are grounded in the real economy. I mean, there's no magic here. It's not that mystical to figure it out. But people hadn't taken a hard look, and that we were having to confront what expectations folks had about these big banks vis-a-vis the smaller banks. So it's really powerful. And the exciting thing is this community of banks, it's growing. And we've even put forth a scorecard where every bank on the planet can score itself against the criteria we have established to be a values-based, impact-driven bank. And it's led to some very interesting conversations, I will say, when we talk to some of the big banks who say, we're an impact bank, we're a real economy bank. And we say, great, let's score you. Let's bring out the scorecard and let's score you. So it's a great way to have a leveling conversation. So it's a terrific example. I think we're going to...
We got time for a question right here at the back. Yes, sir. Hold on just a minute. Got time? Yeah, one more question here.
I'm Herman Davenport. I'm also with Southern. I want to follow along Darren's question about the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. There's also another global network out there, Laurie, and I'm just wondering if there's any connection between the Global Alliance for Banking on Values and this other global network, GIN.
The GIN.
Yes.
Great question, Herman. Yeah.
Global Impact Investors Network.
That's right. That's right. So the Global Impact Investment Network, the GIIN, also they have a great website. They've really become the industry convener for impact investors. It's mostly the investment side of the conversation, not the enterprise side of the conversation, but they are the go-to, I would say, organization. We are members of the Global Impact Investment Network. Several of the members of the Global Alliance for Banking on Values are members. So it's a great question, Herman, but they're separate organizational structures because the GIN is trying to create awareness among investors on how you can do impact investing more effectively and more deliberately. The Global Alliance for Banking on Values is really trying to strengthen commercial banks in their pursuit. So they're maybe, let's call them sisters or cousins, but they are separate organizations. But thanks, great question.
Laurie, thank you. Let's first of all, let's give Laurie a round of applause. And I want to say a very special homecoming welcome to Jan, who spent significant time here in 1992. And we're glad to have you back. Darren, thank you, as always. Your leadership in this state is priceless, and we're honored to partner with you on projects. There's a reception we're having. Thanks to Darren and Southern hosting the reception. You can have one more comment.
Just one.
And then we're going to let everybody network with you.
Okay, great. And yes, I'm staying, and I would love to have conversation. The one final thing I would just like to leave with you is this is relevant no matter who we are, where we live, where we work, our means. It is relevant. Every decision we make with our money has an impact, and it's up to us to figure out what that impact is. So I would just encourage you to think about that as you go forth. What you buy, where you bank, all of this has impact. And we are stewards of our own capital, and we should be owning that as we want to build a more inclusive economy. I just want to say that at the end. Thank you.
Enjoy the reception.